2:45, and we'll have our witnesses come in and we'll resume in public session for session 3. If we could take our seats, thank you very much. Okay, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we will resume now in public session. And is that agreed? Agreed, McAuliffe. Thank you. We're now in public session. I want to welcome everybody. Can I remind witnesses, including myself and members of the media and members of the committee and members of the Oireachtas, that mobile phones should be in the off position for the duration of the meeting to ensure that we allow the safe broadcasting of the proceedings. You're all very welcome to our meeting this afternoon. This is the third session in a series of hearings that the Joint Committee will be conducting over the next 3 days to discuss the implementation of the government decision following the recent publication of the expert group report into matters relating to cases ABC versus Ireland. And in this regard, I want to welcome to our session Dr. Anthony McCarthy, Dr. Joanne Fenton, Dr. John Sheehan from the College of Psychiatry of Ireland, and Professor Patricia from the Department of Adult Psychiatry, UCD, and the Maternal Hospital, and also Professor Veronica, Department of Psychiatry, Tallaght Hospital and TCD. You're all very welcome, and thank you for coming in this afternoon. You're most welcome. Before we begin, can I just remind witnesses regarding privilege that you are protected by the absolute privilege in respect of the evidence you're to give to the committee. However, if you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are entitled thereafter into a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence to be given is connected with such a matter these proceedings to be given, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice effective where possible. You should not criticise nor make charges against any person or persons or entity by name in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. And members are reminded of long-standing parliamentary practice or long-standing ruling of the chair to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official either by name in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So with that, I want to call on Dr. McCarthy to make the opening presentation. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Stand, please, just to facilitate the proper. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so
stand. If you're comfortable with that, yeah.
Stand for all the submission.
Just please, yeah.
Sure. Okay. Hello. Thank you very much. And just like to start by saying the College is very grateful for the invitation to make a presentation here today to the Joint Committee. Pregnancy and the postpartum period can be and frequently are particularly challenging times for the mental health of women. The assessment and appropriate treatment of mental health problems during these times is extremely important. Unwanted.
I know it's a very difficult game here.
I'm used to having teething problems working with babies in the maternity hospital. Don't worry.
Well, you're in a good place in the Shannon champ because there's a couple of babies here too. We won't say that. Sorry,
Unwanted pregnancies are particularly likely to be associated with considerable distress and mental health difficulties for the mother and developmental difficulties for the child. Any woman who has such difficulties deserves compassionate professional help. We're aware that abortion is a difficult and painful issue, not just for individuals, but for the country as a whole. It's a highly divisive issue, and our college is no different from other groups in society in having members with differing and opposing views on the subject. But we're aware that the hearings about the implementation of the government decision is about the implementation of the government decision. We'll be confining ourselves to commenting on the clinical issues and organisational aspects and challenges of this implementation. We don't wish to add to the conflict and distress by commenting on the wider issues so passionately being debated in society. We're also aware that women who come to our clinics in the 3 Dublin maternity hospitals will themselves have widely differing views on their pregnancies, and we wish to be able to provide assessments and treatments in a non-judgmental way to these women. For example, one pregnant woman referred to our clinics may have had 2 previous terminations, now be pregnant, but say that they were pregnancies, not babies from her point of view. Another may have had a miscarriage very early in pregnancy. Technically, the pregnancy may be diagnosed as an empty sac with almost no fetal material, but for her, she was a mother at least for a few weeks. These differences must be understood and respected by any psychiatrist assessing that woman in pregnancy. The 3 of us who work as perinatal psychiatrists have considerable experience of assessing women with mental health difficulties in pregnancy. The fact that no maternity unit outside of Dublin has dedicated perinatal psychiatry specialists is a major cause of concern and disappointment to our college. This means outside of these 3 hospitals, there's no routine assessment or screening for major mental health problems in pregnant women at a time of markedly increased risk, at a time where appropriate advice and intervention can have such vital benefits, not only for the mother herself, but for her bond with her new baby, whose long-term development depends so much on her well-being. The college was invited to send an additional nominee, and we've invited Dr. Meabh, who's behind me, who's a child and adolescent psychiatrist and chair of the child and adolescent faculty of our college, here to address any questions with regards to children, which are a regular issue for us. The Supreme Court specifically recognised the risk of suicide as a legitimate basis for permitting termination of pregnancy, where there's a real and substantial risk to the life of the mother, which can only be removed by the termination of the pregnancy. We understand we've been invited to provide expert psychiatric input into this complex issue of suicide and termination. Suicide is rare in pregnancy, but it does happen, and is a risk we always have to consider. Some figures will help to give a perspective on the rarity of suicide in pregnancy. In the UK, between 2006 and 2008, there were 4 suicides in pregnancy in over 2 million live births. That's 0.2 per 100,000, or 1.5 million births. Suicide rates are lower in pregnant women than in non-pregnant women. And international studies have shown that suicide rate in pregnancy is from 1/3 to 1/6 of the expected rate in non-pregnant women, indicating that for some at least, and frequently in fact, pregnancy confers a protective effect against suicide. However, we're also very conscious of the need to be aware of, but also wary of statistics with regards to suicide in pregnancy or other issues such as the long-term effects of unwanted pregnancy on mental health or of termination of pregnancy on mental health when dealing with any of our patients. We see real women, each of whom is an individual and must be treated as such, not as a statistic. In addition, research shows that there are differences between different cultures and differences between countries where abortion is freely available and where it is legal or illegal. Suicidal ideation in pregnancy is much more common than completed suicide. It's a complex issue. However, much of the public debate about the issue of suicide that we have heard and its risks in pregnancy has, in our view, been simplistic, sometimes harsh and judgmental, frequently uninformed or misinformed, and contrasts markedly with the way suicide and its risk is usually discussed in other circumstances. Particularly recently listening to discussions about cyberbullying and suicide, the sympathy being shown there compared to the way some women in pregnancy have been pejoratively commented on is really horrifying from our point of view. Although it would be impossible to discuss the issue of suicidal risk in all its complexity in a forum such as this or in such a submission, an introduction to some of the key concepts is at least important here to help inform the discussion so that at least the language can be understood, because so often suicide is just talked about a suicide threat, no more than that. There are significant differences between suicidal ideation and suicidal intent and plans. Suicidal ideation means that a person has ideas in their mind about ending their life. These may be just occasional thoughts, or very frequent thoughts, or constant thoughts. As psychiatrists, we're used to making these differentiations. The woman may be relatively unconcerned about them because she knows that she'd never act on them and has had them regularly before. Alternatively, she may be very upset by them or worried by them. She may be terrified by them, feel haunted by them. Sometimes a woman may be ambivalent, oscillating between suicidal thoughts and rejecting such thoughts. Her mental state may fluctuate considerably. Frequently, but unfortunately not always, she will seek help because she's so worried or upset by them. She doesn't actually want to die. She wants to stop thinking about suicide. We know there's a risk that she may eventually feel driven to it, but she needs to be heard, believed, and helped. Some women report a passive death wish. They do not have suicidal thoughts, but indicate they wish they were dead. Others indicate a desire to harm themselves, but again deny any thoughts of actually ending their lives. suicidal intent is different. And I'm going through this detail because there's almost this notion of psychiatrists just say suicide, tick a box. I really want to get some sense of the complexity of the issues and our ability to make these differentiations. Suicidal intent is different. Here the person has an intention or plan to kill themselves. It's no longer just an idea. They may or may not seek help or inform anyone about it. If they do, they may have little faith that they can be helped, maybe a last resort. And here, sensitive and skilled professional assessment is vital. The intention may be immediate or impulsive, or a more long-term plan, sometimes contingent on a particular event or happening. Suicidal ideation may or may not be associated with mental illness. Completed suicide is typically associated with major depression, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, alcohol dependence, but not exclusively so. The term threatening suicide is often used so loosely to describe both suicidal ideation and intention. It may apply to either, but psychiatrists use this term to describe the way the ideation or the intention is communicated rather than as a separate category in itself. Psychiatrists are specially trained to assess the risk of suicide and to treat patients who are suicidal so as to minimize that risk. We're trained to assess whether patients have suicidal ideation or intention or both, to diagnose whether the person is suffering from mental illness or not, and to make or recommend appropriate therapeutic interventions and plans. Of course, we cannot eliminate all risk, as we cannot foretell the future. However, we know also that just by comprehensive assessment, suicide is difficult to predict, and absolute predictive power is limited. There will always be both false negatives and positives. Some people who will appear to have a low risk of suicide or deny such a risk may go on to kill themselves. And equally, others who may appear to have a high risk will not complete suicide. However, psychiatrists are still best placed to make these type of assessments and decisions, and do so on an everyday basis as part of our work. There's been some well-publicized comment that psychiatrists will be manipulated by women threatening suicide. All psychiatrists are very familiar with a small but real number of people who in every area of our work will attempt to manipulate us. And this may happen in many different situations. For example, we'll have the experience of a drug addict maybe threatening to kill themselves unless we prescribe the methadone they allege was stolen from them. Others may threaten to kill themselves unless we admit them to hospital. Others try to convince us they're mentally ill and suicidal when actually they're trying to avoid a court case. These are just examples. But the vast majority of people who present to us for help are very genuinely distressed or depressed, are seeking help, need appropriate, compassionate and skilled professional help. And women in pregnancy are no different in this regard. However, the issue which psychiatrists will be asked to address if the legislation is implemented has two elements. The first is whether there is a real and substantial risk to the life of the mother because of suicidal ideation, and I've just covered that. The second element, and one which only a very small number of psychiatrists in Ireland have been presented with, is whether that risk can only be removed by terminating the pregnancy. As perinatal psychiatrists working in the Dublin Maternity hospitals with over 40 years' experience between us, we've seen many women who are depressed and are distressed and have suicidal ideation, sometimes intent in pregnancy. We've seen women who've harmed themselves in pregnancy, sometimes very seriously. Some of them have tried to kill themselves, sometimes tried to kill the babies, sometimes both. We regularly see women who've had terminations of pregnancy and who describe to us many different reasons for this, including depression or other mental health issues. However, we've not had the experience of seeing any women who are suicidal where the appropriate treatment for their suicidal feelings would have been a termination of pregnancy. We see many women with unplanned and unwanted pregnancies also, but for whom termination is not a choice that they would ever consider. And we really, I suppose, have to add here that we do know that huge numbers of Irish women go to the UK in situations like this. There was no psychiatric input to inform the Supreme Court decision in the X case. However, given that the decision to legislate and regulate has now been taken, and the state's intention is to introduce accessible, effective and timely procedures so that women in these situations can be appropriately assessed. Clearly, if very many of these women were to present to psychiatric services now who did not present before, this would be a considerable extra burden on already overstretched services. However, we're not expecting a huge number of women to come to us at all because they will continue to go to the UK route. Particular consideration will need to be given to the challenges that could be faced in assessing pregnant girls who would need to be assessed by child and adolescent psychiatrists. Also, women with significant learning disabilities are those who may not have mental capacity. An assessment of capacity would be required given the level of emotional distress and the possibility of mental illness being present. It must be remembered that any woman who's mentally distressed or depressed in pregnancy and who has suicidal intent or ideation requires sensitive, compassionate, skilled and non-judgmental assessment. and in most circumstances may need urgent care and treatment. If she's profoundly depressed and mentally ill, she would normally be advised not to take any major life decision at that time, and frequently admission to hospital might be advised. And ongoing review and monitoring would typically be required. Final point. Any psychiatrist should have the right to conscientious objection. And of course, in this area, we would follow the very helpful Medical Council ethical guidelines. However, of course, we then respect that all psychiatrists would still be responsible for ensuring appropriate and timely transfer of that patient to another psychiatrist. To conclude, we're very grateful for this invitation, and we hope that our submission is helpful, and we'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. McCarthy. Now, also welcome Dr. Meabh Doyle to the meeting this afternoon. You're very welcome as well. Thank you. It's now my pleasure to call on Professor Patricia Casey to make her remarks. Dr. Casey, you're very welcome.
Thank you. Mr. Bottom, by the way, I will be reading from this paper which I've prepared, which you have, but I won't be reading it verbatim, but I've left out some of it because
and
it was
you have
quite
10 minutes, so just so you know that.
Thank you. Mr. Bottom and members of the committee, I want to thank you for inviting me to address you today in relation to the expert report on the ABC case. You should have my biographical details, and if you wish, I can provide you with my current CV, and I also have all of the scientific papers that I cited in my submission, my longer submission, should you need them. And I have two major points to make. The first point I want to make is that suicide in pregnancy is very rare, and when it does occur, it is associated with mental illness. And mental illness can be treated and should be treated in the same way in pregnant women as it is in any other person in the population. And the second point I want to make is that there is no evidence that abortion reduces suicide risk in pregnant women, and there is some evidence that it may have a negative effect in some instances. So to come back to my first point, that suicide in pregnancy is rare, and Dr. McCarthy has made most of these points already. It is rare, but it does occur. And a common theme, however, running through much of the research in this area is that suicide during pregnancy is lower than at any other time in a woman's life. So there's some protection for women during pregnancy, apart from a small group who have major mental illness and who are at risk during pregnancy. And I think it's important that we understand the rarity of suicide in pregnancy, because there is an impression out there that many women in Ireland are dying are dying by suicide because we don't have appropriate legislation to govern next, and that is not the case. So let's look at the figures to give it some kind of context. The national suicide rate in women has been static for decades. For about 4 to 5 decades, the rate has been unchanged. And in 2011 in Ireland, 100 women died by suicide. Now, how does that compare then with the figure for women dying in pregnancy? Well, a review of the 3 maternity hospitals in Dublin over a 21-year period found that there were no deaths during pregnancy that involved the delivery of over 680,000 live births. So no deaths during pregnancy during that 21-year period. Turning to the British figures, the Centre for Maternal and Child Enquiries is a British system for examining mortality there, and we have recently aligned ourselves and become involved with that. And the British figures, again, Dr. McCarthy alluded to it, identified 4 deaths by suicide in a 3-year period. That was roughly 1 per 500,000 what are called maternities. Of those, all had major mental illness. And the report found that 69% had suboptimal care. They weren't diagnosed as having mental illness. They were given the incorrect treatment, or treatment was stopped. So there were problems of that sort with them. In Ireland, there have been 2 people dying by suicide identified in the Irish equivalent of that, but it's a draft report and probably won't be published for a few years, so we don't have any further information other than that there were 2 suicides. So this information confirms that suicide in pregnancy is rare and that it's related to significant mental illness. And the authors of this study also emphasise the importance, the critical importance of identifying and treating mental illness in pregnancy adequately. The report also sadly found that 4 women died during pregnancy in Britain. That's in a country where abortion is readily available. So really, these deaths had nothing to do with the non-availability of abortion, but rather to do with the inadequate treatment of mental illness. Now, a related matter in relation to abortion and suicide is how good are we at predicting suicide? And the answer is we are not good at all. And that's not because we're incompetent. It's the inherent in suicide that it's very difficult to predict, because it consists of behaviour that's often unpredictable, and somebody might be suicidal one day and a few days later be perfectly well. Or other things might happen in their lives to either remove the suicide risk or introduce new suicide risk. So we are not good at predicting suicide. And there are numerous studies suggesting and showing that, in fact, we're wrong more often than we're right. For 100 cases that would be predicted as dying by suicide, only 3 will actually do according to some of the studies. So a woman who is pregnant and suicidal, as Dr. McCarthy says, needs proper treatment. In my clinical practice, as I'm sure every other psychiatrist in the country does, if somebody is suicidal and at immediate risk, we admit them to hospital. We carry out a full assessment of them, as well as getting background information from family members, from their GPs, and then we arrive at a diagnosis and a plan of treatment. And that can take time. I confess that in my work as a psychiatrist, and I run the attempted suicide service in the Mater Hospital, where we see and assess over 400 attempted suicides in women per year. And I have never seen a pregnant woman who was suicidal for whom abortion was the only answer. I have seen pregnant suicidal women who needed admission to hospital and were very ill, who needed treatment. I have seen pregnant suicidal women who have taken overdoses and have asked for an abortion. But when you spend time with them and do a full assessment and talk to them, in the 2 instances I'm referring to, both of them were actually being coerced by family and partners. And the reason for the overdose was not because they wanted an abortion, even though on the surface that was what they said. The reason they overdosed was because they just wanted to escape the incessant pressure that was being placed on them to make an abortion decision. With support, they ultimately decided against the abortion and, I understand, gave birth. Now, that brings us to the next question. Is abortion an actual proven treatment for women who are suicidal? There is no evidence that abortion is a treatment that helps women's mental health or that prevents suicide in pregnant women. And this was recently investigated by a very large-scale study carried out by the Medical Royal Colleges, headed by the Royal College of Psychiatrists in London. And this examined all of the studies, all of the quality studies that were published in peer-reviewed papers to ascertain whether abortion harmed women's health or helped them, their mental health in pregnancy. And whether it harmed women's health or helped women's health during pregnancy. And the outcome was the same whether women with unwanted pregnancies gave birth or had abortions. It made no difference to their mental health. But the one crucial thing they did find was that in a subgroup of people, abortion did cause mental health problems. And they were people who had prior mental health problems. So the group whom you think might benefit from an abortion were actually the group most at risk of problems. So to summarise, suicide in pregnancy is rare. There is no evidence that abortion helps women's mental health on the basis of the studies that have been done. It is 20 years since the X case decision. And we now have much more information about the impact of abortion on women's mental health and on the possible harms to it. in essence, ex-case legislation would expect doctors to recommend an intervention, i.e. abortion, that has not been shown to be of benefit to mental health, to prevent a rare outcome, i.e. suicide, that cannot be predicted. In my view, legislation for X that includes suicide risk is not supported by any scientific evidence, and the X test that suicide might occur or will occur on the balance of probability and can only be averted by suicide, those two tests, that it will occur on the balance of probability and cannot be averted by suicide, cannot be met. So in my opinion, suicide risk as a ground for abortion should be excluded from the X-case legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Casey. And our next witness is Professor Veronica O'Kane. Professor O'Kane, you've got 10 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks very much. My name is actually just, it's O'Kane, actually, rather than O'Kane. And I'm very grateful to the committee for inviting me to give this presentation today. And my name is Veronica O'Kane. I'm a clinical psychiatrist in Tallaght, in Dublin. I'm a professor of psychiatry in Trinity College. And I led a national perinatal psychiatry service in the UK for 5 years. So I have expertise in perinatal psychiatry, general adult psychiatry, and I also set up the psychiatric service in Beaumont Hospital. So I have a lot of experience of managing people with deliberate self-harm and of organising services. And the reason I'm here today is because I have this fantastic opportunity to explain to the legislators of our country about my experiences with women who are suicidal and who are pregnant. I'm going to talk about the expert group report recommendations in relation to legislation and regulation for mental health grounds. And I think it's important to say that the expert group report refers to mental health grounds, not just to suicide, and that's slightly wider than the discussion that has taken place. And there are two main areas of interest in this regard. One is serious mental illness, which Professor Casey and Dr. McCarthy have spoken about at length. And the other area is unwanted pregnancies leading to suicidal ideation or suicidal intent. The first area of serious mental illness, again, has been covered by my two colleagues here, and basically involves the management and the care of women who have pre-existing mental health problems, very serious mental health problems like schizophrenia, bad bipolar disorder, or severe and recurrent depression. And these women can become suicidal when they're depressed because of their mental illness, or sometimes because of the biology of the pregnancy affects their brain function. And sometimes, though rarely, these women can become pregnant because they have an unwanted pregnancy. Now, when I worked in the UK, we managed the woman individually according to her particular problem. And again, I think that the evidence given by the other witnesses, I would completely agree with that, within this group of women with serious mental illness, the way to manage them and to help them is to treat the mental illness. And following that, usually these women go on to have babies. Unfortunately, not every single woman who has serious mental illness and who is pregnant wants to continue with her pregnancy. The same is true of women with serious mental illness as women who do not have serious mental illness. Some women feel they can't cope with the pregnancy, and particularly women who have serious mental illness who have previous children taken off them and brought into care. And in the UK, I witnessed a case where a woman had 4 previous pregnancies where the baby had been taken into care and was currently pregnant with her 5th child. So there are rare cases of people with serious mental illness who do not want to proceed with their pregnancy. But the other area that's much more common is the area of unwanted pregnancy and suicidality. And some women do become suicidal because they can't cope with the prospect of an unwanted pregnancy and unwanted parenthood. And in relation to this, I think what springs to my mind is the cases of childhood abuse, and particularly childhood sexual abuse, where that child during adolescence or early adulthood has an unwanted pregnancy. Because they have because they've had these particular experiences, they feel unprepared and unable to parent a child themselves because perhaps they haven't had adequate parenting themselves. And the other issue is they feel they can't give up the child for adoption because they feel if they did that, they would be abandoning the child in the same way that they were abandoned when they were young. The other area I think that's quite common in relation to unwanted pregnancies and serious suicidal ideation is when young girls, adolescents, become pregnant when intoxicated. And we live in it's a public health problem, the drug-drink culture amongst our youths. And I certainly in my clinical practice have seen very young women who become pregnant and by definition are raped because they're not aware of the circumstances in which they conceived. And these girls, they're just emerging from the protection of childhood. They're always terribly shamed. Sometimes they're absolutely preoccupied with ideas of self-loathing, and they are actively suicidal. And in these cases, it seems to me, these girls are taken by their parents to London and to other parts of the UK and Europe where they avail of abortion services, and thus they are no longer suicidal. So I think that the difference here, people are being presented with a scenario whereby the experts are saying suicidality does not occur in a situation, that abortion is never an answer, the only answer in a situation where a woman is suicidal and pregnant. And that's because the experts in this area only see very rarefied cases. They only see the cases with the serious mental illness. If, for example, a woman or a young girl is suicidal because of an unwanted pregnancy, the last place she's going to go is to an obstetric unit and check in there and say, I'm pregnant. She's not going to do that. She's going to go to her GP, and she's certainly not going to go to she's not going to attend a perinatal psychiatrist because she doesn't go to the obstetric services. She's going to go to her GP. And if you look at the GP literature, and there was a study recently presented by Mark Murphy in regard to this, the bulk of patients who are pregnant are seen by the GPs. 97% of GPs have had consultations with patients in relation to unwanted pregnancies. And that's why that discrepancy exists between the evidence that's been given here and what actually happens in real life. The second area that I wanted to talk to was the special group's recommendations for establishing criteria for determining the risk to the life of the mother. The report states, and I think this is important, that the medical practitioners need to be aware that it is not necessary that the risk be inevitable or immediate, but that the risk should be established as a matter of probability. And Anthony McCarthy has addressed this point. Risk management is absolutely the bread and butter of psychiatry. It is central to our clinical practice. It is what we do every day. We work within the Mental Health Act. The Mental Health Act obliges us as a legal process to assess a person's risk, to comment upon their risk to themselves and their risk to others. This is something that we do all the time. We do it within legal frameworks. Voluntary patients who come into our hospitals also have legal risk assessments, written risk assessments done on them. Most people in Ireland who die by suicide do not see psychiatrists. And the people who do see psychiatrists actually, I think, are managed quite well and get a fairly good deal in general. And that's why of 100 patients who attend psychiatrists, only 3, as Professor Casey said, who are predicted to be at risk of suicide will actually go on to commit suicide because they are managed by the service. And the whole thrust of our national programme, which the HSE is rolling out now in relation to suicide prevention, is to get people into the psychiatric services so that we can manage that risk. It is a matter for the legal profession and for the legislators here to talk about how they may proceed to enact the legislation and the regulations. But from my position, the recommendations that have been given to us by the expert group report, thank you very much, are excellent. I think psychiatrists can act in an advisory capacity in terms of helping to form this legislation and regulations, and we can help to fine-tune it afterwards in the same way that we have done with the Mental Health Act in the last 10 years since its introduction in 2002. And my final point relates to the debate and not to the subject matter of the hearings about whether we should legislate or not. 130,000 Irish women have had abortions since 1983. 5,000 per year, approximately 14 per day. What would happen if abortion services that are available in the UK and Europe were not available to Irish women today? What happens inevitably when there are no abortion services available is that death and injury ensue. Injury to women, death to women, and death to babies. Unfortunately, in countries where abortion services are not available, that is what happens. We must remember why we are here today. We're here because of the X case, and this is the most obvious evidence, the X case that is, of a risk of suicide that can be real and substantial and can only be averted by an abortion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Keane, for your presentation. There now is 60 minutes for members and questions and answers. It's questions and answers, so and talk to Billy Keller, Deputy Keller.
Thanks, Chairman. Just to welcome the witnesses again here. I suppose just in the context of the differing positions that have been presented to us, we'll certainly need to try and elucidate and get some further clarity. Professor O'Keane highlighted the issue that 130,000 women have travelled abroad since 1983 for terminations in the UK. We then had Professor Casey saying that, you know, suicidality, suicide ideation, and suicide itself are reasonably rare, but suicide itself is very rare among pregnant women. But the question I have to ask here is there a cohort of obviously women who are in crisis pregnancy who go abroad, who could be very much at risk, and they are not being taken into account in the figures and the statistics? Right? That would be critically important for the committee. Of all the women that travel abroad, you know, would there be a higher percentage of those people who are there because it's a crisis pregnancy, it's an unwanted pregnancy, or for whatever reason, but they're going abroad for a termination? In the event of they not being able to terminate that pregnancy, is there a potential for self-harm and suicide? And that clearly is something that is of critical importance to this committee in its deliberations and its determinations. And I think that we just need to get clarity in that particular issue. Also, the issue that has been highlighted with regard to the ability of psychiatrists to assess suicide in its varying degrees, from ideation to intent to actual suicide itself. You know, have you got the clinical ability to differentiate in most cases between the various forms or threats to the life of a woman? And I think that's just something that we would also like to get a bit of clarity on. So the two key issues that I've highlighted certainly I feel are critically important. And they are varying views, obviously, even among the cohort here today. And if that is the case, well then, you know, what form of assessment? Is there varying assessments being carried out by psychiatrists in different hospitals? Is there set criteria? Is there set guidelines? When you come out of college after studying psychiatry for so many years, what is the criteria that people use in terms of assessing suicide and ideation to intent to suicide itself? And if there are varying views and varying assessments, well then obviously as legislators we will have a very difficult task ahead of us in trying to address this particular issue. But I do want absolute clarity before I leave this place today with regard to the issue of the 130,000 women who have gone to the UK in general for terminations. Is there a chance or a probability that a higher percentage of those women, because they found themselves in crisis pregnancy, would have suicidal tendencies and potentially carry out the actual act of suicide itself?
Thank you. And talk to Kevin O'Quillan.
I'd just like to welcome the panellists, each of you. And I've noted that you have all, indeed, as others have this morning, who have come before us, emphasised that the risk to the life of the pregnant woman through suicidal intent is noted only in rare instances, to your knowledge. And hopefully it's as rare as you suggest. But I have to pose the question to each of you in turn. Is this a reason not to legislate, regulate for the rare situations that may present, and which you have all at least accepted can occur? And I'd ask that each of the panellists who have contributed and others among you would answer that question. And again, just to emphasise, we as a committee are only a conduit. We're not determinants in this particular situation. the information is for the benefit of those whose responsibility is to draft the legislation and regulations. Two last points, because we have very little time, unfortunately. There was much emphasis placed on the fact that there are only 3 perinatal psychiatrists in the jurisdiction. And we're delighted to have you all, I think, before us here this afternoon. Professor O'Kane, on the other hand, O'Kane, Gomaleshgil, I get it all the time, mine's even more difficult, is not one of you. Yet, as she has quite rightly said, she has perinatal psychiatric expertise. My question posed already to the Medical Council representatives here this morning: where are we short in terms of the necessary professional cover to effectively provide the necessary supports for pregnant women where issues in relation to mental health and the more serious situations that might present in relation to either suicidal ideation or suicidal intent? And my last question, I am a little concerned, and I think it's important, Professor Casey, in relation to will the suicide ground for abortion be open to abuse? I'm just reading your submission and listening carefully to what you said. And this is not what you said, but it's almost like a suggested subtext, and I would have to ask you the question, and just to hope that you will take it respectfully, please. There is, in my view, a suggestion that professional colleagues of yours would be complicit in such abuse. And I would like to know, how you would answer that. That is how I read what you are suggesting, that if this particular aspect was opened up in terms of suicide ground, that it would be open to abuse. Ultimately, the decision must be made by the medical practitioners. In this instance, in relation to suicidal intent, it would have to be made by psychiatrists first and foremost.
Thank you, Deputy Coulter. And talk to Seamus Healy.
To Cathaoirleach, and to thank the witnesses for their submissions. And I'll be brief, Cathaoirleach. Obviously, from what we've heard this afternoon and again this morning, suicide in pregnancy is very rare indeed. So I'm just wondering, there is a suggestion out there, and it's been made quite regularly, that legislating for suicide in this area would open the floodgates, as has been said, on the basis of mental health. And I just wonder if our witnesses could just address that subject and the related issue, and that I think Deputy O'Quillan has mentioned this as well, or referred to it indirectly, the whole question of whether or not, and the suggestion being made, that women may manipulate their doctors in relation to this area. I think that's something that maybe the witnesses might address for us as well. And in relation to the assessment, the fact that there are only 3 perinatal psychiatrists in the country, what effect does that have on the assessment process? And how would our witnesses see that assessment process taking place? And will there be need for additional resources in this area to deal with it? Thank you, Cathaoirleach.
Thank you, Deputy Healy. And finally, in this section, last Deputy Coulter.
And to thank the witnesses for their presentations. We, just before this presentation, before lunch, heard from the masters of the maternity hospitals, and they quite clearly said that abortion is not a